predictable in maneuver, recoverable from the kind of mishandling that combat conditions imposed. The helicopter that defined an era was not particularly fast, not particularly armored, and not particularly modern in any technical sense.
It was trusted.
In the language of pilots who depended on it daily, that was the only metric that mattered. When you heard Jolly Green, you knew you might live. Air Force pilots shot down over North Vietnam knew the call sign before they needed it. The knowledge that Jolly Green was available changed the calculus of every mission. Not because it guaranteed rescue, but because it made rescue possible. 53 HH-3E crew members were killed doing it. The pilots they recovered numbered in the hundreds. No subsequent rescue aircraft earned the same emotional weight among the pilots it served. The Sea Knight never became famous. No film gave it a signature sound. No single operation attached its name to an iconic moment. The aircraft had an unremarkable profile and an unmistakable ramp. The rear-loading door that allowed vehicles and cargo to be driven directly into the fuselage. The pilots who flew it were not famous. They flew more than 1,000 combat missions in Vietnam. They flew in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The UH-1 was retired in 2015. The Marine Corps that retired it was already looking for a replacement that could do the same thing reliably. Flying below the tree line was not in the specification. The UH-1 Iroquois was designed as a utility helicopter, and the pilots who flew it in Vietnam improvised everything else. They flew it lower than doctrine recommended, because low was where the information was. They flew it faster than the book suggested, because fast was harder to hit. They flew it through situations the test pilots had not tested, because the situations arose and the 06 was what they had. The ones who flew it longest said it responded to intention before it responded to input, which is the highest compliment a pilot can give a machine. The first purpose-built helicopter gunship in the world flew in 1965. And what its pilots valued was not the weapons, it was the predictability. Before the Cobra, armed helicopters were transports with guns attached. And they flew like transports with guns attached. Heavy, slow to respond, honest about every instability. Pilots who flew the Cobra described a machine that communicated through the controls, the rotor feedback, the pedal pressure, the collective response. 50 years and multiple upgrades later, the Marine Corps still flies an AH-1 variant. The fundamental honesty of the design has not required replacement. The Army's requirement for a Huey replacement specified a helicopter that could survive in the environment where Hueys had died. What the pilots found when the Black Hawk entered service in 1979 was a machine that did what the requirements savent about defend. More than 4,000 have been built in more than 40 years. It balances everything, gives back more than you put in, and tells you the truth. Night, rain, dust. Night, rain, dust. The conditions that had previously ended attack helicopter operations became in the Apache the conditions under which the Apache worked best.
The distinction mattered to them.
The helicopter was the platform. The sensors and the weapons were the capability. What they trusted was the combination. A machine that knew where it was, knew what it was looking at, and gave its crew enough time to make a decision. Time in an attack helicopter over a defended target was the only thing that mattered. Kia pilots described the aircraft in anatomical terms. It felt like an extension of the body, rather than a machine operated by the body. The mass-mounted sight that gave it its distinctive profile allowed the pilot to expose only the center ground forces Genrant. Crews flew in Iraq and Afghanistan at altitudes and in conditions that the aircraft specifications did not suggest were appropriate. The aircraft did what its pilots asked. When it was retired in 2017, the Army discovered that nothing in the inventory did the reconnaissance mission in the same way. Two counter-rotating tandem rotors, one in front, one behind, eliminated the tail rotor, eliminated the torque problem.
Predictable.
The CH-47 Chinook did not demand that its pilots compensate for its tendencies.
It went where it was pointed. It carried what was loaded.
It climbed at high altitude in Afghanistan when the aerodynamic calculations suggested it should not have been able to. The helicopter the Army first fielded in 1962 is still in production. The word pilots use most often about it is the simplest.
It works.
The Sikorsky S-64 was designed to carry maximum load with minimum airframe. And what its pilots discovered was that the simplicity of the design produced a precision of control that more complex helicopters could not replicate. Lifting a transformer onto a rooftop, positioning a drilling rig on a mountaintop, carrying a crashed aircraft from a mountain ridgeline. These are operations where the pilot's ability to hold position to within inches in crosswinds over terrain that ground equipment cannot reach is the entire capability being delivered. Sky crane pilots described the aircraft not as a vehicle but as a tool, one that responded to intent with a fidelity that made the impossible merely very difficult.
Heavy, honest, capable.
The word CH-53 crews returned to most often was powerful. Crews who retrieved crashed aircraft from landing zones under fire, who extracted equipment that could not be left behind. They flew the CH-53 because it was the only aircraft that could do what the missions required. They loved it because it was strong enough to do the work. Its pilots flew in conditions that land-based helicopter pilots did not encounter. Salt air corrosion, ship deck motion, navigation over featureless water where the nearest landmark was the carrier they had left an hour earlier. What they found was an aircraft that absorbed the environment, the moisture, the motion, the corrosion, and continued to perform to specification. The Sea King recovered Apollo astronauts from the Pacific Ocean. It flew the anti-submarine patrols that were the first line of deterrence against Soviet submarines. Its pilots trusted it over water in a way that is only possible when a machine has never given them a reason not to. 249 miles per hour, the Westland Lynx set the absolute helicopter speed record in August 1986. Royal Navy and Army pilots described the Lynx as the most responsive military helicopter they had flown. A machine that did what the controls asked without the delay or imprecision that larger or less rigidly rotor aircraft introduced. It was used in the Falklands, in the Gulf War, in Bosnia. The pilots who flew it in those operations valued speed for the same reason pilots have always valued speed, because it compressed the time the enemy had to respond. It forgave mistakes that killed you in other helicopters. What pilots in every one of those environments described is the same characteristic: a tolerance for errors in technique and judgments that comparable Western helicopters did not share. The Mi-8's wide operating envelope, its powerful twin turboshaft engines, its ability to continue flying in conditions of partial mechanical failure, these were not design specifications that distinguished it from its contemporaries in the marketing material. They were the properties its pilots discovered over decades of operating it in the kind of conditions where the difference for forgiving or occur difference between an incident and a funeral. At 14,000 feet above sea level, the air is thin enough that most helicopters operate at or near their performance limits. The AS-350 Écureuil was designed with a high-altitude power margin that gave mountain pilots the one thing they needed most: options.